Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, East Asian Gardens. This is Kate at the Schomburg Library. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to leave those. Yvonne is going to save all of those questions until the end, but we will definitely get to them. So tonight, presenting East Asian Gardens, we have Yvonne Wolf, who was born in Taiwan and educated in the US and Europe. She has extensive experience living and working internationally in Denmark and Japan in human resources and as a global language trainer. She is fluent in English, Mandarin, and Danish, and has studied Japanese, Spanish, and Greek. Between work and personal travels, she has visited more than 20 countries and 25 states within the US. After settling with her family in the Chicago area, she formed Chinese Intercultural LLC to help American business leaders to develop and strengthen their ability to communicate confidently and effectively with Chinese business people. So Yvonne, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and very nice to see everyone. I am here to present the introduction to East Asian Garden. I'm very, let's see, I'm going to, so just 1 second where I will share my screen. Now this is a very nice time to think about gardens. Just last week, I was at the Chicago Botanical Gardens, and I will share with you some of the places that you can familiar yourself with the same thematic motifs. So when you go to East Asian Garden sometime this summer or spring, I hope you will enjoy it even more than you have before. So here is a familiar site also from the Chicago Botanical Gardens. This is one of the Japanese islands, and I just want to make sure that you can see something that's familiar to what I am here to present. I'm here to present the East Asian Garden and some of these motifs that you commonly see, like the pine tree. Today I will go over just 4 big topics. Now, the cultural understanding of the Chinese garden. I use the Chinese garden, I use the Japanese garden term. Now, sometimes people might want to know, but I've only been to Japanese gardens, and what is the Chinese garden? So here I'm going to explain the terminology and a little background about what we see or what Americans are typically more familiar with. And then I will talk about 2 main principles of beauty. What are we seeing? What kind of aesthetics is presented at the Japanese garden or the Chinese garden? These 2 principles are defined really based on Confucianism and Taoism. And these are examples that's in the garden, which I will show you through this presentation. And then I will show you 5 motifs of what you might find familiarly, and now you understand what they mean. Now, this is a very introductory exercise and an option to understand that East Asian context. So at this point, this program in 45 minutes, we're not going to get into how the Chinese or Japanese or Korean gardens differ. We're not even there yet. So today, I just want to give you an idea of the whole type of things you may have seen before and what they might mean. So first, we start with the terminology. Is it Japanese garden or is it Chinese garden? Now, many of us are far more familiar with Japanese gardens. And Japanese gardens there's a lot of them, it seems like, right? If you've been to the Anderson Japanese Gardens in Rockford, if you've been to Chicago Botanical Gardens, you might have seen the Japanese islands, which is quite extensive. So then there's also a garden you may not be familiar with. It's very small, but it's near the Science and Industry Museum. It's called the Garden of the Phoenix. Now that one, I will also show you pictures, and that is based on a Japanese style garden. There's also Pingtong Park near Chinatown. So that is a Chinese garden. But then we will see how many similarities they share. So when it comes to the terminology, is it Chinese, is it Japanese? The reason I introduce you to the East Asian gardens is because they have so much cultural similarities. I believe that Japan and China are separate political entities, and they are separate political sovereignties. But when it comes to culture, they have so much in common and such a long relationship that they really come from the same traditions. So that means we're talking about 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. That's what I mean. So that's why is, to me, when I talk about the East Asian garden, I'm talking about the tradition, which we learn to distinguish certain plants that belong into the East Asian garden and what they symbolize and what they mean in that East Asian context. So first, I like to use the analogy of wine or cheese. Now, what is your favorite wine or cheese? Is it French? Is it, since we live so close to Wisconsin, is it Wisconsin cheese? Now, I come from California, and I only lived in Illinois for 10 years. Most of my life, I lived in California. So when I think of wine, it's California. It's not Napa. It's some other California area. So for me, that defines what my go-to wine would be. I'm sure that there are French people out there who say, oh, no, that California wine isn't a true Chardonnay or isn't a true Champagne. So that's where the distinction tend to split off or turn to be very specific. So I like to tell you about the East Asian garden in the sense that we're talking about all French traditional wines or for traditional cheeses. And we're not going to really go into the distinction of each one really at this level. The other thing I'd like to help you start with our journey on is the context, is the East Asian context of what gardens mean and what is the differences. For example, whose garden is it anyway? The East Asian context, and it goes back a few thousand years, but it's true still now. You can, that even 1,000 years ago, the cities on our planet were far more crowded in Asia than in Europe. And of course, America has had our cities in 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but it wasn't the kind of density, the kind of population that the East Asia is familiar with. So the population in East Asian cities, Tokyo, you're thinking Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, very densely populated. So that means that land has always been scarce. Now, China seemed like a huge country, but the part that people would like to live on, or the part that is arable land, the part that there's rivers that you can drink water from, it's not a lot of land compared to the number of people who live there. Now, China, Vietnam, all these East Asian countries have always been, again, crowded with more people than Europe. And this is true for many hundreds of years. Just think now, you think of Hong Kong, it's all these skyscrapers, right? Taiwan is like that too. So I would say one big difference would be in something that we need to change our perspective right from the beginning in this presentation is the scarcity of available land. Here, where you live, where I live, Illinois, we're very fortunate, and we are looking at maybe 90 or 80% of the homes are single resident homes. Sure, there's apartments. Sure, you have Chicago with all those apartments, but people are actually moving out during this pandemic. But in Asia, there's nowhere to move out. In Asia, 90% of people live in condominiums and apartments, stacked up very, very high. The traditional beautiful courtyard houses or small single home houses are very few. So very few and very few that remain. So think about Japan. Now Japan is a country which has about half of the US population on all those little islands. So just imagine, right, how much land there is for growing gardens. And then you think about who can afford land for a garden. So it's not just a matter of, wow, you must be very rich to have a garden, but this idea that it's just impossible to even imagine that you have land enough that you don't need to first grow food. You have to think before the industrialization of food production. And two, you don't need that space to build a room for your children to sleep in bunk beds. Okay, so just thinking about having to be wealthy enough to take care of those needs, and then you still have a garden. Okay, so this tradition is a very long tradition. That means that people in Asia have lived with very little extra land. Who would have such a space? Well, I can tell you that in Asia we have in the tradition is from China. So this East Asian garden tradition came from China. In China, the people who had a nice garden was the imperial gardens. So there was only royalty. And now you might be thinking of Forbidden City and Beijing, but well, that capital city has only been there for the last 600 years or so. So before that, China had different capital cities. So these capital cities moved around, and palaces had impressive, extensive gardens. It was from this tradition that the Japanese also loaned, and they have gardens that even now is still very much based on the imperial gardens and imperial tradition. In fact, Kyoto, if anybody out there has been to Kyoto, the whole grid-like city is a plan that they took from a blueprint plan they took from a Chinese imperial city. So this idea of who can have a garden is usually only the imperial people, royal people. And then when you come to the idea of later in Chinese tradition, the Silk Road created a very, very rich merchant class. So then in the southern part of China, I'm talking about outside of Shanghai, Hangzhou, Suzhou, and these southern cities where they have a longer flowering season, better than Beijing, okay? They can grow many more flowers, and these merchant class started to have extensive gardens. In fact, these extensive gardens, we think right now, when we look at records of people's property, walled gardens, they were probably about 800 of them at the height of the merchant trade, commercial trade. Currently, there are about 200 that have been restored. What happened, you think about the 600? Well, they're probably under some subway, under apartment complex, or under a new harbor. So they will never be restored. And that is a development of a tradition of scarcity of land that still exists today. I hope you feel more comfortable with the term of Japanese garden or Chinese garden, and I will propose a name, that term that will be even better to understand the East Asian motifs. So then I like to now come to the point of two main principles of beauty so you can see what is it that you like or enjoy so much about the East Asian garden. Well, you see that I highlight the part we're in, so I don't want to lose you in any case. So I will like to go on to the points of beauty, and these principles of beauty is based on Confucianism and Taoism. So Confucius teaching is, the goal of it is to learn to be, or to be a learned gentleman or gentlewoman. I know this gentleman, gentlewoman, this sounds long, but it's because that in modern times, in the last 200 years or so, the term has become much more unisex. But sure, before that, Confucianism used this gentleman term strictly for men because men were the only ones who were educated. But of course, as time goes by, there's more women being welcomed into that, and I would say it's very much a gentleman, gentlewoman is a unisex term. So the goal is to be a learned gentleman and gentlewoman. So how do you get there? I do a whole talk on Confucianism itself, so right here I can just give you a really short answer. And the Confucianism in a nutshell tells us that to become a learned gentleman, gentlewoman, it means you have to seek self and inner cultivation. You have to look inside yourself, and you have to maintain a balance with natural energies and control your wild and crazy, erratic emotions. And how do you do that? You learn, you cultivate, you learn from nature, and you learn to see the energy and bring it inside. Now, how do you cultivate yourself? Well, you are like a fine plant. It has to be directed, and it has to be well maintained. So in the garden, and how do you do it, right? So in Chinese, there's the Confucian arts. Now, the original Confucian arts is 6, and now there's 8. It's a long tradition. Confucianism has been around about 2,000 years. So let's just say the most recent idea is that it came down to 8, and these are 8 arts in which that Confucianism believed that as you practice these 8 arts, you become a finer person. You become less prone to violence, and you learn to rein in your personality, and you become a finer person. So these 8 arts are music, which is the far left one. The second one is Go, is a game. This is a type of chess game or strategic game played with black and white pebbles with 2 players. The third one is calligraphy on the top, and then the far right corner, that is paintings and watercolor. And then the bottom 4 on the far left bottom is poetry. Second one is wine, but not the wine that you think of getting drunk or anything like that. The wine is about connoisseur of wine, and you use this to become a better poet, a better player in the arts. And the flower, which is in the bottom, second to the right, the flower means, maybe you're familiar with ikebana. Ikebana is one of the classical Confucian art. And then the far right bottom is the tea. So tea is an art in which you can become a better person. So the garden is a place where you can practice these arts. The garden itself is part of this tradition is where you can become a person of more peaceful nature. Now, we don't have to tell you exactly how to do it, but there are symbols here in the East Asian Garden that helps us move from a more stressful or nervous part of ourselves to a much calmer and a true self. And that's what Confucianism, in a very short, briefly, stand for, is to move away from violence and find a more peaceful and more truer self. Now, the other principle of beauty, the B, number 2, is Taoism. Now, you may have seen this term start with T, but T and D, Taoism is D is closer to the way Chinese is spoken. So Taoism is a even older tradition than Confucianism. I think I gave you a 2,000 year mark for Confucianism. Taoism, they think, is much older. They say maybe it's 3,000 or 4,000, but it really comes from before it was recorded in a written format, that it was an oral tradition that goes back to Cro-Magnon people, that kind of tradition. The reason I say that is because it's very based on nature's observations, the way the universe works. For example, people observed back then that the sun always rises from the east and always sets on the west. So that is a law of nature. It could never be the other way. The beauty, the principle of beauty is dependent on two energies, and that is the yin and yang. You might have heard of yin and yang, but yang is the Mandarin pronunciation. So yin and yang is two energies, and here I use this picture of the water and the fire. The fire representing the sun, so it's just hot, and then the cold energy represents the moon, and yin is the colder shadow energy. So the Taoism is a very much nature-based, meaning that Taoism saw that half of our day is daytime and half of our day is nighttime. So that perfect balance creates growth of vegetation. If you have too much yang, then the plants die. If you have too much water, the plants die, right? If you have too much water, too much flood, they die. So we need something right in between, and that creates harmony, and that creates the perfect place to grow. And so do people. People need a perfect place to cultivate the inner energy and not just react to the outside world. So what does this mean in a garden? Because I can talk yin and yang about 45 minutes. So the yin and yang in the garden, here we have some. I will explain to you the visible part and the invisible part. So the visible part is that the mountain is a harder, angular energy, and the water is a softer, curvy energy. So here I show you these Chinese characters because you can see the mountain is kind of a perpendicular, angular character. And then you have water that looks like a splash of water just moving in movement. And you see this yin and yang sign, there's a curve in the middle. That curve means that the line between isn't solid. It isn't hard. It is always fluctuating. So between yang and yin and yang, that somewhere we will find that perfect place, that Goldilocks moment, right? So the visible is demonstrated in the garden as mountain and water. So these are two elements that must be represented in the East Asian garden. So now so these two things about Confucianism and about Taoism, they're always working in the East Asian garden. It's not just one versus another. They just merge together. So there's no clear distinction or separation of them. So now I can tell you about a little bit of the invisible part. So Taoism is about being close to nature, that you follow nature's way. Like nature is a teacher, and it demonstrates where you could become, where you could go. So the yin and yang, you should never fight against nature. You see, they say if you try to fight against nature, man always loses. So we want to work on the invisible as well as the visible energy and respect it. So the invisible, I like to talk about, and just one because I can't do too much in this talk, is qi. Have you heard of Tai Chi, that term qi? And also, I'd like you to now put your hand here and try to say this sound qi. So it sounds like cheek without the K. So try to say qi. And if you can feel there's breath on your hand, that you can feel the aspirated air, qi, that is energy. Now, remember, Taoism is science before science as we know it now. So the Chinese did not know about nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen. They don't know anything about that. But they do know that this qi, this breath of air, that's what distinguishes us from something that's dead. So as long as you're alive, you got qi. Okay, so qi is something you can feel. You can't necessarily see it, but it's definitely something you can feel. Taoism believes that all things have qi. So that's alive, that is. Okay, so that means that it demonstrates that also animals, right, has qi. And then when the air we feel around us, that's qi of nature. Okay, so, and then the qi is also something you can see in the sense that the sense of stamina and survival, vitality, that is qi. That is the energy that grows. And it demonstrates it by its growth. We don't know what, right? We cannot do, we cannot see the oxygen or the glucose that comes from the photosynthesis, because this is pre-science as we know it, right? So this is a time we didn't know about that, but they could see, Chinese Taoism could see that plants were growing. So there must be some kind of qi going on that it could do that. So in the sense of qi, something that's old or has lived a long life has a young energy. It means it has survived against odds. It has survived against illnesses. So that is a stability and stamina, consistency that's like the sun. And therefore, it's a young energy. And youth is erratic, kind of jumpy, grows in wild directions. That is yin. It's more unpredictable. Another pair, like yin-yang pair I call it, is the illusion versus real. And then there's also the artifice versus wildlife. And that means that in a East Asian garden, what distinguishes is that you don't see plants growing wild as they naturally appear. All the plants and trees you see there has been perfectly pruned or trimmed so that they present a view, a landscape for you to admire, but it is a tamed type of vegetation. It is not growing wild. Okay, and then it is also some of the scenery we'll see is the idea that we're using a little bit of land, but we create an illusion that, oh, we got mountains and streams and we got a whole lot of walking to do, but only on an itty bitty bit of land. So that is the real versus illusion, which I will demonstrate as we see when we actually enter the East Asian garden. So now I will show you some of these Confucian and Taoist examples. Now, this has a lot to do with myself coming to Illinois. My children were small. They were 4 and 5, and they were very they were very crazy, right? Wild, rambunctious little boys. Now we enjoyed all this nature preserves, and I take them to see a real prairie. Now when I came here, I was so impressed with these prairies, because these prairies, these naturally, right, restored prairies, I can't believe how huge these wild flowers were. Some of them are 4 feet tall. That's totally not what I imagined. Like, from LA, I was thinking, here I might be dating myself, of the little house on the prairie, just running through prairie that's so tamed and beautiful, wild grass. But these kind of restored prairies, oh my gosh, I would never go in there. That, it looks prickly and dangerous. Well, so my children enjoy all this wild preserve where you can just run, or you can just, well, we better prepare for hiking for an hour, or we have to come back. We have to really decide how far we're going to go on these outdoor garden experience. But when we come to the East Asian garden, I realize that I have to teach them how to appreciate them, how to enter the East Asian garden with a sense of some rules and some purpose. And so that's when I realized that there is something different that we could share with them, culturally, and I could teach them something about my culture that I grew up with. So in general, this East Asian culture has lots of rules and quite of a, let's say, a culture that enjoys the rules, because being restrained, only by doing so we can be our true selves. So one of the biggest questions when I enter into the Confucian garden is like, why are there no straight paths? While my children were used to going to the wildlife preserve or the Cook County preserves, where you just hike and bike as long as you can and then you turn around, these East Asian gardens are often curvy and zigzag paths. And here, this is a Pingtung Park across from Chinatown. You might be familiar with this place because you can take a water taxi to get to this park. Now, across the park, it's just one side of it is just industrial warehouses, not pretty at all. And this piece of land was given to Chinatown because they didn't know what to do with that piece of land, and the Chinese said, "Oh, we can come up with a garden." They're familiar with working with very little land and make it into something a little nicer. So why are there no straight paths? And we might see this very often on bridges. And then you might say, okay, because, well, remember I said about the scarcity of land? Here we're trying to create the illusion that you have this wonderful view, but you only have a little bit of land to work with. So you make those paths kind of windy and you feel like, wow, I'm on a different side. I have a different view. I turned around. Okay, so you utilize that garden experience. And some people always like to say, "Oh, Yvonne, I hear that the Chinese people are so superstitious." Well, superstition is just a way of seeing the world. I think that so one belief. So I always tell people a little bit about there's a practical reason that there's not enough land, but there's also perhaps a spiritual or the otherworldly or the paranormal type of explanation, and that is that in Chinese and Japanese and Korean beliefs, ghosts and the dead spirits can only go straight. So that means that if you're on a zigzag path on a bridge, you are safe. Ghosts cannot chase you if you are walking on these little meandering paths. And you might say, "Oh, that's so silly." Well, I learned also from my research that Scottish folklore, remember in Wizard of Oz, you have the witch that's afraid of water, right? So that in Scottish folklore, witches are afraid of water. And if you can cross a bridge, witches cannot cross bridges, cannot cross waters, and there you've proven yourself not a witch. And then there's often a question about why are there parts where you cannot reach on foot? What is the point? So in the opening picture I showed you on the right, Chicago Botanic Gardens, where you're standing on this side, and then but they're over across, circled in purple, and they'll tell you a sign that says you cannot go there. Okay, it's just from viewing from here. And you have the same situation here in Pingtown Park, where the whole Chicago skyline is right there. But they built a bridge just over it so you can see it as you cross this bridge on a winding way. So why is it? Well, there's a term for this in the East Asian garden or in the Confucian garden. It's called a borrowed scene. A borrowed scene is a motif that's used in Chinese, Japanese gardens to borrow someone else's scene where you can't afford that piece of land. And this is a motif that's used very much, and that is also why Chicago Botanic Gardens has an area which they maintain also, but they don't let anyone walk over there. So that is a way of using land as well as to its maximum potential. And then there is a question about why are there moon doors, right? To the right, you have a moon door, and then you have these galleries or walks where, or even you've seen a little like a little building or edifice that's only got a hut with 2 walls. So if you were sitting inside this little hut and it's raining, you're gonna get wet. If it hails, you're gonna get hurt. Okay, there's no real protection in these little huts or walkways and doorways. And sometimes these walls just pop out of nowhere in these Japanese and Chinese gardens. It's not even part of a real building. Why is that? Well, if you stand there at these doorways, this is a wind tunnel, and it brings the qi, the air, the wind circulate, and ventilation is what you feel. That is what the East Asian garden feel as the life energy and qi. And you go to a garden to absorb this qi, and you would feel so-called more energy from the movement of air. When it's very hot in this summer, this is better than air conditioning. You can really feel the air move when they build these edifices that actually just there for moving the air, and not necessarily to protect you from any kind of rain or sun. And then pavilions, you might see pavilions or gazebos. Now, gazebos is a very trendy and fashionable in the 17th century, even in European palace gardens. And that tradition came from China. So these pavilions, you see the straight lines, and they are creating a straight line, and the wavy willows are in flowing water. They are creating curves. Straight lines and curves is a yin-yang pair. So here you have the 2 distinctive shapes, the yang being the straight lines, and the yin is the wavy lines. And then there's the mountain and water. Now mountains, now you might think, real mountains? Well, I don't see any mountains here. Well, the hill you see behind the bridge or next to the bridge, that hill in the garden motif is a mountain. And the rocks, they symbolize mountains as well. In the Confucian or the East Asian garden, it's absolutely necessary to have water. So on the right, you have river. It can be river, it could be pond, it could be artificial, or, and I will go, I will show you some examples. They could be fake. So for example, here we have water as an artificial pond, and there's flowing energy. So the water is moving, and that's the idea, that you have flowing energy. And then you have fake mountains, which is considered stagnant, stability. That is it's a young energy that's frozen in time. So fake mountains here are the rocks. Now the rocks, it's hard to explain this, a cultural message here, but the rocks, you see these two rocks, they almost look like, they're very weathered, right, by water, and they almost look like statues. These kind of rocks with holes in it, and I learned from geology that it's limestone that can have these holes. The holes actually shows how old these rocks are. Now back then, people didn't know what's a million years, did not have any idea how many millions of years old this rock was. But they did know that this rock is going to outlive you, outlive me, outlive presidents. So these rocks are very old. The idea is that these rocks are also have survived a longer time and many more crises. So this is a view of looking at rocks as a strong energy, that energy that it has persevered. Now, when you think of this, you might say, well, geez, I mean, it's a rock, right? I mean, isn't it supposed to stay the same? Well, people didn't know that. They didn't assume so. And in fact, there is a bit of research I came across that they said, well, the Chinese are versed in so many arts. And I'm talking about 2,000 years ago, so many arts. They carve jade, they carve, let's say, the olive pit. I mean, they carve ivory, of course. They carve they do paintings, they do all sorts of arts, right? But they are rather underdeveloped in the area of carving statues. I'm talking about the contemporary to Chinese civilization in the Chinese art world of the Greeks or the Italian David or Greek statues of goddesses and gods. And they said that Chinese doesn't seem to have a deficiency in that area. The Chinese never took off on this carving a statue art. And why is that? And one of these answers was that the Chinese had traditionally saw weathered rock as already carved by nature. And especially when you can see a somewhat of a human form, like almost a nature-made statue, that rock is in fact have lived a life and has persevered and has a life of its own. And I don't expect you to agree with me, but I just like you to consider this idea and to understand that there's an idea that goes like that, right? That such an idea exists. And so that's why we often, when this often doesn't happen in the East Asian garden, that to see people standing on rocks, there just seems like something's wrong about that. So when we look at rocks, I will show you some other rocks in this presentation as well. So here we have color contrast, and so the fish, people ask about fish, why is there koi and why is there so many? Well, rarely we will ever see just like one fish. in the East Asian garden, the one fish would be very sad. It's considered to see all these fish as a symbol of domestic bliss, of family life, of being cared for and taken care of. And these fish are pets. They don't have to fend the outside world. And seeing them, feeding them, to see that color contrast, they can't stop moving. And that is energy that we enjoy seeing in the East Asian garden. There are yin and yang in trees. Now, you may be familiar with bonsais. Now, these are bonsais from the exquisite collection at Chicago Botanical Gardens. Now, bonsais are actually, they may look old, but they aren't as old as they appear. And here is an example of this controlling wildlife, controlling that cultivate wildlife so it can look like as if it's an old tree. And here these are very exquisite ones, but if you go to the supermarket and you buy a bonsai, then those little ones, they're not that old. They're just a sapling. But then the idea is that if you can trim it and meticulously care for it, it can give you the illusion of an old tree in the forest. And then the practical idea is that it's so unthinkable to own a forest. And I know here there are people who own forests in Wisconsin, or they own a summer home with lake on the side. Well, in Asia, it's very impossible. It's astronomical to own a forest. So that's why if there's any, it would be owned by the government or the national park. So to have your own little forest on your tabletop is so precious. It's very exciting. You can own your own little forest at your windowsill. And so this idea of a bonsai, both a very highly cultivated art, but also on the practical side, something that a piece of a forest you can own and possess. You can imagine yourself walking through there. That is just priceless. And now I'd like to share with you some of these common motifs, even though we did cover some, but I think that you will be more familiar as we go through these 5 motifs. There's rocks and there's pine trees. Now these rocks with holes in them, they're also called longevity stones. And longevity stones is considered a rock that's lived a long life, lived a very powerfully sustained and persevered a long life. So longevity stones is considered good luck. That means that if you have a stone like this in your garden, it reminds you that you could live that long one day. And there are also there are rocks in East Asia, and this is an example of the market for rocks. That if you can find a rock that has a certain coloration that looks like a mountain, or it looks like a entity, a person sitting or standing, those kind of rocks can demand extremely high price. Now, I'm not saying that I personally would spend $1 million on a rock, but in Asia, there is such a market. All I can tell you is that the fact that there is such a market, a certain rock in its as natural form as possible, carved by nature, would demand millions and millions of US dollars, and there's a market competing for that. That is something that's culturally relevant. And pine trees, whereas it got angular lines, it represents longevity, but next to the rocks, it's considered rather young. So here we have the young and the old, yin and yang, again, a pair that is being celebrated here. Bonsai, this is a bonsai garden I visited in China, and you can see a number of these bonsais, just little forests in a pot. And you can build this in a relatively small bit of space and still have a forest in pots. The potted gardens are very common, they're very fashionable in Asia. If you have balcony gardens, that's what it looks like over there. And here you have pines. Now, pines again, you have the straight arms that reach up and they show they're a sign of vitality, health, and stamina. Now, health, I don't know if you know this out there. But but many trees that you might have in a garden, they can die and they can become very sick. And you might have seen after I moved here, the elm trees, ash trees, there's that ash borer bug, and a lot of them were taken out. I have a lilac outside that died, just didn't come back one spring. Well, have you noticed that the pines rarely get sick? And they come back year after year. On top of that, during the winter, they stay green. And before people knew about the difference between deciduous trees, that was a miracle itself, that evergreens could stay green all year long. So that's why the pine is a symbol of longevity and health. And the bamboo is a sign of flexibility, resilience, and rejuvenation. And that means that the bamboo grows extremely fast. And it's a symbol of summer. It is also one of the role models that under Confucius design as a gentleman. Now, the Confucius designated the bamboo as a gentleman because it is a role model for us to contemplate and to admire. The bamboo is a role model because even in a big storm, you may see the bamboo bend and bend and bend, but it won't break. And when the wind is over, it comes right back. And that flexibility is a sign of being a true gentleman. And that is to our gentlewoman, as someone that can hold your ground, but not break. That you can survive whatever troubling you, and you can bounce back. It's like I said before, that bamboos are extremely they grow extremely fast. And in the summer, sometimes you have to curtail where you want your bamboo, or else it'll take over the whole yard. And that sign of growth and just energy is always a good sign in the Chinese world. And of course, bamboo is it has so many meanings that I cannot cover it all right here. And now we come to rocks again. And here, rocks do look like a statue. And it is considered having a life of its own. In fact, here, and I can show you, you see how the path winds its way all the way to this rock that looks like a statue. And that rock, sometimes it has a label there that is considered an old man. And you might not be able to see this shape, but you see how one part is longer than the other. That longer sign is a sleeve in the Chinese clothing, so it's considered, may not be a person, but it's considered definitely an entity that is in that rock. So the reason I bring this up is because my kids, we were in this garden in China, and then they follow the path, and they say, okay, follow all the way, and they say, it just ends up in front of a rock. What's the point? And I said, well, that is the point, that you take that path to see and admire this rock. The rock is a statue, it's a entity, and you are there to respect and pay your respect to this rock. Now, willows is a very common sign near water, and bridges. And willow is one of these trees that's considered a yin tree, not a yang tree. And that's because it curves. It has very flowy lines. It flows with the water. And the yin, so willow is often considered a beautiful woman, is often considered or described with words that describe a willow tree. And then lastly, the lotus. The lotus is a sign of summer. If you're at this position, you will see that the leaves are waving and they're alive almost. And they grow very big and large. The bridge that you go on is actually the stable part, right? Doesn't move. And then the lotus is a part that's alive and beckoning you. So this is that difference between motion and stillness. And the soft and hard lines here is defined by the straightness of the bridge and the softness of the lotus. Now the lotus here, I introduced now a different, a lotus is part of a different philosophy and that is the Buddhism. The lotus is a huge, meaningful sign in East Asia, representing its connection to Buddha, which comes from India. Okay, so it's an Indian religion that came to China and East Asia. And so let's see. So I can show you here. It's even better because we can't see it under all those big leaves. But here you see the lotus. It's growing in mud, in muck, in water that's not clear. But it lifts itself up and it still blooms in a clean and beautiful, and the leaves do not get soiled. And that's the symbolism for you to remember whatever trouble you're going through, you can lift yourself away from the muck. You can still reach and be your full potential regardless of the other people who try to bring you down. And that is also why the Buddha sits on a lotus flower. The Buddha is a God that rises above all that is dirty and undesirable, and the negativity, let's say that brings people down. So now I'm going to recap a little bit with you. So this journey, now is it to go through the garden as fast as you can? Rocks, are they alive? And water, is it a necessary component in the Japanese gardens? And pines, what do pines represent? Is it young or old? And the illusion, what is the purpose of having fake bridges, a bonsai? I hope you feel more confident of answering these questions now than we started with. I hope also that you will have a much more deeper appreciation of the East Asian garden on your next visit.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. If anyone has questions for Yvonne, make sure to put them down in the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We've got one here already. Someone asks, the concept of a walking garden in Japan is about 200 years old. Previously, gardens were intended for contemplation from one point. Did anything like this happen in China?
Oh yes, this is the whole philosophy that the Japanese borrowed from the Chinese tradition. So the idea is that you're there to contemplate on your life and on your inner self. Is not a place to run around. Okay, so it's definitely, that is the same philosophy. and it comes from Chinese tradition. So sometimes, yes. So when I lived in Japan, when I'm in a Japanese garden, and they often say that this is a Chinese tradition which we borrowed and we took off with it, right? So just like my example with wine and cheese, that just because it comes from France doesn't mean that we can't celebrate it as just as richly in other countries where it came from.
All right, we have another person asking, does bamboo fountain dripping water have a meaning? And also raking the gravel into a pattern.
Oh yes, okay. So that's my. I didn't know, how long this could get into, so it is already 8. But yes, the dripping water is also part of that contemplation. This is very much from Buddhism, where you're trying to, believe it or not, trying to match your heartbeat to the drip. Okay, and the idea is to slow down enough that you can control your heartbeat. Now sounds difficult to do, but that's part of those high goals for meditation. We're not all going to get there, but that's what the intent and the goal is. As far as gravel design, in my presentation here, I think we got it. We didn't have like an hour and a half, so I didn't go into that. But when I mentioned the fake rocks or fake mountains, well, there are fake water too. So when you see white gravel, and there's raking those shapes of circle, it is fake water. Those lines are ripples of water, and you're supposed to contemplate that there's water there, even though there isn't. So that's how fake water plays a role. And even though you don't see water, water and mountain are both there.
Okay, and then do you have time for a couple more, Yvonne?
Yes,
okay. So the next question is, how easy is it to build my own Asian garden at home, and what do I need?
This is exactly what happened last year. I've been doing these presentations of East Asian gardens. I enjoy it so much. Last year, we were all stuck. We were all stuck at home. So my husband built me one. And we just decided that, well, I only have this itty bitty piece of land, right? And we got some bamboo. So bamboo, and we had some, and to make it a little bit, let's say, maintenance easy on us, my husband just happened to buy these tiny dwarf pines. And then if you plant irises, now irises is another Confucian gentleman, so that's a good sign. And then we also had a dry creek, what we call a dry creek, which is a pebble made creek that just waiting this year to get a tiny bridge to make that scene perfect. So it doesn't take a lot, and I'm sure you can get some inspiration from this program to just what you can do with a tiny bit of land.
Okay, and last question. What do you think of the Jackson Park Japanese Garden? And have you been to the Grand Rapids Meyer Japanese Garden, recently installed a few years ago by a well-known Japanese landscaper?
Well, I can tell you, let me see. I do have, I can see if I can show you. Yes, let me show you the Jackson Park. I believe, is that the one across from the Science Industry Museum? I think so. Let me see if I can show you this picture, and just one moment. So yeah, so this one, can you see this? Can you see this little bridge? So this is from Garden of Phoenix in Chicago, and it could be Jackson Park, because it's a big park, and this is part of that park. It's very small. Again, it's a very tiny piece that is the Japanese garden, and it has a tiny bridge. Again, this whole idea is that this bridge is make you think of a bigger piece of landscape, and sometimes people feel like, wow, this bridge, you got to be like a toddler to be able to go on it. Well, this is not meant for anybody grown up to even step on it sometimes, and the reason is because if we shrink everything down, we can actually be in a bigger garden, right? So that illusion, and you can see the rock here. So this is the one I'm thinking of. The other one you mentioned, I haven't been, but I'm sure many of these designs are based on the similar tradition and the idea of creating a scenery with very little bit of space. This summer, I plan to visit a Japanese garden. I think it's called Morikami Garden. It's outside of Baton Rouge, or no, Boca Raton in Florida. So there are a lot of these Chinese and Japanese gardens all over the United States. Many of them are Japanese rather than Chinese, and that's just a different immigration tradition in America. Also, a lot of the Japanese companies, they became major sponsors of Japanese gardens, and they brought out their culture. But there are places with Chinese gardens, like Seattle. There is an extensive Chinese garden there. I say you go to as many as you can. I enjoy them. I take my children to both kinds because I just want them to know and learn something about my East Asian heritage.
All right, well, thank you so much, Yvonne. And thank you to all of you who came and stayed for this presentation. We hope to see you at another library program again soon. Have a good night.
I will send a handout to you. And thank you very much for having me, and I hope you will you'll get more out of